Let us begin with a simple yet profound counterfactual proposition. Imagine that in the tumultuous political landscape of early 1930s Germany, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party fail to seize power. Perhaps President Paul von Hindenburg refuses to appoint him Chancellor in January 1933. Maybe the internal rivalries within the Nazi Party cause it to fracture and collapse before it can consolidate its hold on the state. The reasons are less important than the outcome. The fragile Weimar Republic, battered by economic depression and political extremism, manages to survive. It limps on, a deeply flawed but still functioning democracy at the heart of Europe. This single change, this one divergence from the historical path, would not simply alter the future, it would create an entirely different one. Without the Nazis, Germany's trajectory would have been one of gradual, painful recovery rather than aggressive, ideological rearmament. The government, likely a coalition of centrist and conservative parties under a figure like Kurt von Schleicher or Heinrich Brüning, would have focused its efforts on stabilizing the economy. The hyper-militarization of society would not have occurred. The persecutions, the purges, and the systematic dismantling of civil liberties that defined the Third Reich would be absent. Germany would remain a troubled nation, certainly, grappling with the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles and the scars of the Great Depression, but it would remain within the community of European nations, a problem to be managed rather than a threat to be conquered. The survival of a democratic, or at least an authoritarian but non-Nazi, Germany fundamentally reshapes the European chessboard. The primary engine of the Second World War is removed from the equation. There is no Anschluss with Austria, no dismemberment of Czechoslovakia at Munich, and most critically, no invasion of Poland in 1939. The intricate web of alliances and appeasement policies that defined the late 1930s would be rendered moot. Britain and France would not be forced into a desperate scramble to rearm against an expansionist German superpower. The continent would be spared the cataclysm that claimed tens of millions of lives and reduced its cities to rubble, setting the stage for a completely different kind of 20th century history. This is not to say Europe would be a utopia. The deep-seated issues that plagued the interwar period would persist. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin would still loom menacingly in the East, its ambitions for ideological expansion unchecked. Economic rivalries, colonial tensions, and simmering nationalist disputes would continue to cause friction between the great powers. The political atmosphere would remain tense, a complex dance of diplomacy and deterrence. However, the specific genocidal and totalizing ideology of Nazism would be confined to the fringes of political discourse, a dark what-if for German historians, rather than the central horrifying reality of Europe's mid-century experience. The continent would have navigated its crises without the singular destructive force of Hitler. In an alternate 2025, the map of European power would look remarkably different. Without the devastation of a Second World War, the old great powers would have retained far more of their global standing. The United Kingdom, its empire evolving rather than collapsing in the fires of conflict, would remain a formidable global force. Its economic and military might, not having been bled dry fighting Germany, would project influence far beyond its shores. The Royal Navy would still command the seas, and the City of London would be the undisputed financial capital of the world, its position never seriously challenged by New York. Britain's global network of dominions and colonies would transition into a more robust and economically integrated Commonwealth, a true third superpower bloc. France, spared the humiliation of defeat and occupation, would stand as the primary military and cultural power on the European continent. Its large professional army would be the guarantor of the post-Great War settlement, a bulwark against any resurgent German ambitions or Soviet expansionism. Paris would continue its reign as the epicenter of art, fashion, and intellectual thought, its cultural hegemony unbroken. The French colonial empire, particularly in Africa and Indochina, would likely have faced pressures for independence, but the transition would have been more gradual and managed. preserving strong economic and political ties to Paris. France would be the confident, assertive leader of a continental bloc aimed at maintaining the status quo. Germany, having navigated its economic woes without resorting to fascism, would emerge as a powerful but chastened industrial giant. Its economic engine, focused on export and innovation rather than military production, would make it the workshop of Europe. However, its political influence would be carefully constrained by the terms of the Versailles Treaty and the watchful eyes of its neighbours, particularly France and a reconstituted Poland. Germany's strength would be purely economic, its military ambitions permanently curtailed. It would be a prosperous, stable but politically second-tier nation, its path to redemption lying in commerce rather than conquest, a giant with its hands tied. Meanwhile, other nations would play more significant roles than they did in our timeline. The Kingdom of Italy, never fully embracing a junior partnership with the dominant Nazi Germany, might have pursued a more independent, Mediterranean-focused foreign policy under a less radical form of fascism or a restored monarchy. Poland, its sovereignty and borders intact, would be a crucial Eastern European power, a buffer state balancing the interests of Germany and the Soviet Union. The Austro-Hungarian successor states, like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, would have developed their own distinct national paths, without the trauma of Nazi and then Soviet domination, creating a more politically diverse and complex Central Europe. The question of a Cold War in this alternate timeline is a fascinating one. It is highly probable that a confrontation between the capitalist West and the communist Soviet Union would still have occurred, but its nature and participants would be different. The fundamental ideological clash between Leninism, Stalinism and liberal democracy was inherent and predated Hitler's rise. Stalin's paranoia, his expansionist ambitions and his brutal suppression of dissent were not dependent on the existence of a Nazi Germany. In fact, a non-Nazi Europe might have presented the Soviet Union with a different set of opportunities for spreading its influence across a continent not unified by a common enemy. The Cold War in this scenario would not be a bipolar contest between the USA and the USSR. Instead, it would be a multipolar struggle. The main antagonists would be the Soviet Union on one side and a powerful European alliance led by Britain and France on the other. The United States, having never been drawn into a European war, would likely have maintained its isolationist stance for much longer. It would be a concerned spectator, a mighty economic power across the Atlantic, but not the direct leader of the free world. The front line of this ideological battle would run through Eastern Europe, with Britain and France, not America, providing the military and economic support to contain Soviet expansion. The conflict's dynamics would be profoundly altered. Without the Red Army's liberation of Eastern Europe from the Nazis, communist puppet governments would not have been so easily installed. The Iron Curtain might never have descended in such a stark and sudden manner. Instead, the struggle would be one of subversion, espionage and proxy conflicts in politically volatile states. Poland, the Baltic states and the Balkans would become intense battlegrounds for influence between the Franco-British alliance and the Soviet Comintern. The nuclear arms race might also have developed differently, perhaps more slowly, and involving more players, with Britain and France likely developing their own atomic weapons independently and earlier. Ultimately, who would have won this Cold War? It is plausible that the European powers would have been more successful in containing the Soviet Union. A strong, economically vibrant and militarily capable Western Europe, led by an undefeated Britain and France, would have presented a more formidable and immediate barrier to Soviet ambitions than the war-ravaged continent of our history. The USSR, facing a powerful bloc on its very doorstep, and lacking the prestige of its victory in the Great Patriotic War, might have found its ideological appeal diminished and its expansionist goals thwarted. The collapse of the Soviet system might have come sooner, not from economic exhaustion competing with the USA, but from its failure to break the European cordon sanitaire. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, a fragile construct of competing ethnicities and religions, was held together by the Serbian monarchy in the interwar period. In our timeline, its invasion and brutal partition by the Axis powers during the Second World War simultaneously destroyed the old order and created the conditions for Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans to emerge as a unifying force. Tito's unique brand of federalism and his strong-arm rule were direct consequences of the war. Without that crucible of conflict, the fate of Yugoslavia would have been very different, and its dissolution was likely still inevitable, though it would have occurred under different circumstances and for different reasons. Without an external invasion, the internal pressures within Yugoslavia would have continued to mount throughout the mid-20th century. The centralizing tendencies of the Serbian-dominated government in Belgrade were a constant source of friction with Croat, Slovene, and other nationalist movements who sought greater autonomy or outright independence. The political landscape of the 1930s was already fraught with assassinations and ethnic tensions. In a world without a world war, these nationalist aspirations would not have been suppressed by a common enemy or a communist regime. Instead, they would have festered and grown, likely leading to a political crisis or a civil war by the 1940s or 1950s. The breakup would have been a messy, perhaps violent affair, but it would have been an internal matter, influenced by the great powers rather than directly caused by them. France, as a traditional ally of Serbia, would likely have supported the maintenance of a unified Yugoslavia, seeing it as a key element of stability in the Balkans. Italy might have seen an opportunity to expand its influence along the Adriatic coast, supporting Croat separatists. Britain would have likely sought a diplomatic solution to avoid a wider conflict that could draw in other powers. The dissolution would resemble a series of political negotiations punctuated by low-level ethnic conflict, rather than the brutal all-out wars of the 1990s. The resulting states would therefore look different. A kingdom of Serbia might have survived, while Croatia could have emerged as an independent state, perhaps under Italian influence. Slovenia might have gravitated towards a Central European sphere, aligning with Austria and Czechoslovakia. Bosnia, a multi-ethnic tinderbox, would have been the most difficult problem to solve, its fate potentially decided by international conferences and partitioned borders drawn by European diplomats in Paris or London. The breakup of Yugoslavia was arguably baked into its creation. The absence of Hitler would simply have changed the timeline and the manner of its demise, leading to a Balkan map drawn by diplomats, not generals. In this alternate Europe, the continent's power center would be firmly anchored in the West, but not in the way we understand it today. The dominant axis of influence would not be the American-led NATO alliance, but a powerful, self-reliant Franco-German partnership. This relationship, you see, would not be born from the ashes of war and a shared desire for reconciliation, but from a pragmatic calculation of mutual interest. France, as the preeminent military and diplomatic power, would need Germany's economic might to create a continental bloc capable of standing up to both the Soviet Union in the east and the Anglo-American powers across the sea and the Channel. It would be, well, a marriage of convenience, defined by French strategic leadership and German industrial power. This Franco-German core would be the engine of European integration, but with a distinctly different character. It would be less about pooled sovereignty and supranational institutions like the European Union of our timeline, and more about a traditional alliance of nation-states. The goal would be economic cooperation and collective security, managed through intergovernmental treaties rather than a Brussels-based bureaucracy. This so-called European Confederation might include the Benelux countries and perhaps Italy and Austria, all operating within the framework set by Paris and a politically subordinate Berlin. The emphasis would be on maintaining French political primacy while harnessing German economic dynamism. The power, crucially, would not shift eastwards. Eastern Europe, without the shared trauma of Nazi and Soviet occupation, would be more fragmented. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary would be fiercely independent nations, wary of both German economic dominance and Soviet ideological pressure. They would look to the Franco-British alliance for security guarantees, acting as a buffer zone rather than an integrated part of a federal Europe. The eastward expansion of Europe would be a slow, cautious process of building alliances, not a rapid integration of former communist states. The continent's economic and political center of gravity would remain squarely on the Rhine. This Western European bloc would project its power globally, with France maintaining its sphere of influence in Africa. It would compete with the British Commonwealth and the United States for markets and resources. This Europe would be more inward-looking and protectionist, focused on securing its own continental prosperity and security. The relationship with the United Kingdom would be one of respectful rivalry, a continuation of centuries of competition between the two dominant Western European powers. The continent would be self-sufficient, confident, and led unequivocally from Paris, with Berlin serving as its indispensable economic partner. The cultural and social fabric of a Europe that avoided a Second World War would be profoundly different, marked by continuity rather than rupture. The modernist movements in art, architecture, and literature that were suppressed or distorted by fascism and war would have continued their evolution unabated. The Bauhaus school, for instance, would not have been shut down and its proponents scattered across the globe. Instead, it would have continued to shape German and European design, leading to a more streamlined, functionalist aesthetic becoming mainstream much earlier. European cities would have been rebuilt and modernized according to avant-garde principles, not as a matter of post-war necessity, but as a symbol of progress. Society would be more traditional and class-structured in many ways. The massive social leveling that occurred as a result of total war, the empowerment of women through their entry into the workforce, the breakdown of old aristocratic hierarchies, the creation of the welfare state would have happened more slowly, if at all. Social change would have been evolutionary, not revolutionary. The established order, led by the old elites in Britain and France, would have remained more firmly in place. This would also mean that some of the darker aspects of the pre-war era, such as widespread anti-Semitism and colonial attitudes, would have taken longer to fade without the stark moral lesson of the Holocaust and the collapse of empires. Economically, Europe would be wealthier, but perhaps less dynamic than the post-war boom experienced in our timeline. Without the Marshall Plan and the impetus for mass production driven by the war effort, the so-called 30 glorious years of growth might have been less spectacular. The economy would be dominated by established European corporations, cartels, and colonial trading blocs, with less influence from American multinationals. Technological development would follow a different path. While nuclear energy would likely still be developed for civilian purposes, the focus on rocketry and jet propulsion, so heavily funded by military imperatives in our history, might have lagged. Instead, investment might have flowed into other areas, such as maritime technology, railways, and chemicals. This alternative Europe would also be a place of greater cultural diversity. The Holocaust, the single greatest tragedy of the 20th century, would have been averted. Millions of Jewish people, the vibrant heart of so many Central and Eastern European cities, would have survived and continued to enrich the continent's intellectual, artistic, and scientific life. Cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Vienna would retain their large, thriving Jewish communities, profoundly shaping their character. The mass displacement of populations, the ethnic cleansing, and the redrawing of borders that followed the war would not have happened, leaving a more complex and interwoven tapestry of peoples and cultures across the continent, preserving a world that was, sadly, tragically lost. In this alternate 2025, the hierarchy of European nations would be a reflection of a world where colonial power and industrial might were preserved, not destroyed by war. The rankings for economy, military, and overall influence would look quite different from our own. By economy, the United Kingdom, with its global financial network and integrated Commonwealth trading bloc, would be the wealthiest nation. The City of London's supremacy would be, frankly, unchallenged. Germany, as the industrial heartland of the continent, would have an export-driven economy focused on engineering, chemicals, and manufacturing, immense, even if its political power were constrained. France would come third with a strong, balanced economy, a large colonial market, a robust agricultural sector, and luxury goods industries. Italy would be a significant industrial power in the Mediterranean, with strong manufacturing in its northern regions. The Soviet Union, with its state-controlled command economy, would be vast in scale but inefficient and lagging in innovation compared to its capitalist rivals. By military strength, the United Kingdom would remain the world's most powerful fleet, complemented by a professional army and the global reach of the Royal Air Force, all backed by an independent nuclear deterrent. France would possess the largest and most modern land army on the continent, a formidable navy, and its own nuclear force de frappe, making it the undisputed military leader of continental Europe. The Soviet Union's Red Army would be massive in size, a huge force of manpower and tanks, but its technology and strategic doctrine would be continually challenged by the more advanced Franco-British forces. Italy would have a strong navy focused on dominating the Mediterranean Sea and a sizable army to project power in North Africa and the Balkans. Poland would field a large and well-motivated army, supported by French and British equipment, serving as a critical frontline state against potential Soviet aggression. By total influence, a blend of economic, military, cultural, and diplomatic power, the United Kingdom would be unrivaled. Its global empire-turned-commonwealth, financial dominance, military reach, and cultural soft power, like the English language and the BBC, would place it in a league of its own. France would be the dominant power on the European continent, its military leadership, cultural prestige, and diplomatic network making Paris the most important capital between London and Moscow. The Soviet Union would remain a formidable but isolated superpower, its influence significant but largely confined to the communist world and, well, feared rather than respected by its neighbors. Germany would be an economic giant but a political junior partner, its influence felt through trade and finance, but its foreign policy heavily guided by Paris and London. Italy would be a regional power with significant influence over the Mediterranean basin, the Balkans, and parts of Africa, carving out its own sphere of interest. Language is really a direct reflection of power, and in a Europe where history took a different turn, the linguistic map would be, well, completely redrawn. The overwhelming global dominance of English would be a lot less pronounced and, honestly, would face a significant rival. So instead of just one lingua franca, Europe would probably have two primary languages of international communication, each dominant in its own sphere. English would, without a doubt, still be a crucial language for global trade, finance, and maritime affairs, all thanks to the enduring power of the British Commonwealth and its close, if sometimes rivalrous, relationship with the United States. It would be the language of the boardroom in places like London, Hong Kong, and Sydney. However, on the European continent itself, French would retain its historical position as the premier language of diplomacy, culture, and high society. With France as the undisputed political and military leader of the continental bloc, French would be the working language of the so-called European Confederation. Major treaties, diplomatic communiques, and intellectual debates would all be conducted in French. Learning French would actually be essential for any aspiring politician, diplomat, or artist from Berlin to Rome to Warsaw. The prestige of Parisian culture, unbroken by war and occupation, would ensure that its language remained a powerful symbol of sophistication and influence across the continent. German would really solidify its position as the language of engineering, industry, and commerce within Central Europe. As Germany's economic engine powered the continent, its language would be absolutely indispensable for business and technology. Anyone involved in manufacturing, trade, or scientific research within the Franco-German-led European sphere would need at least a working knowledge of German. It would be a practical, technical language, less about diplomatic prestige and more about economic necessity. This, naturally, would create a trilingual elite in many European nations, with individuals needing English for global trade, French for politics, and German for industry. Other languages would have a stronger regional standing too. Italian would be influential throughout the Mediterranean basin, a key language for trade and culture in North Africa and the Balkans. Russian would, of course, be dominant within the Soviet sphere, but its study in Western Europe would be driven primarily by strategic and intelligence concerns, rather than any real cultural appeal. The mass language learning trends we see today, driven by American pop culture and the internet, would be replaced by a much more pragmatic, multi-layered approach. A well-educated European in this alternate 2025 would likely be fluent in their native tongue, plus French, and either English or German, depending on their profession and geographic location. In this alternate history, Eastern Europe would not be a monolithic bloc subjugated by a single power. Instead, it would, revert to its historical role as a shatterbelt of competing influences, a complex mosaic of alliances and rivalries shaped by the great powers surrounding it. The region would be a primary arena for the Cold War between the Franco-British alliance and the Soviet Union. The fate of nations like Poland, Czechia, Hungary, and the Balkan states would be determined by their ability to navigate the pressures exerted by their powerful neighbors, France, Germany, and the Soviet Union. Poland, having avoided invasion and partition, would be a key regional power in its own right. Geographically positioned between Germany and Russia, its foreign policy would be a delicate balancing act. It would be a staunch military ally of France, relying on the French army as the ultimate guarantor of its borders against both historical adversaries. Economically, though, it would be deeply integrated with Germany, its industries and agriculture supplying the German market. This would create a constant tension in Warsaw, balancing its security dependence on Paris with its economic dependence on Berlin, making it a crucial but perpetually anxious frontline state. Czechia, or more accurately, Czechoslovakia, since the Slovak separation might not have occurred in the same way, would find itself firmly within the German economic sphere. Its highly developed industrial base, particularly in arms manufacturing and engineering, would be a natural partner for German industry. Culturally and politically, however, it would look towards Paris, sharing a democratic tradition and a suspicion of German dominance. Hungary, on the other hand, might pursue a more independent and nationalist path. It could seek patronage from Italy to counterbalance German economic pressure and French diplomatic influence, perhaps even attempting to form its own small bloc of influence with Austria or Balkan states. The Balkans would be a patchwork of competing loyalties. Serbia, as the core of a diminished Yugoslavia, or as an independent kingdom, would remain a client of France and a rival of an Italian-influenced Croatia. Romania, with its oil reserves, would be a strategic prize, courted by both the Western European powers and the Soviet Union. Bulgaria, with its historical ties to Russia, might be the most susceptible to Soviet influence, potentially becoming a voluntary, if wary, ally of Moscow. This complex web of alliances would make Eastern Europe a far more dynamic and volatile region than the frozen, monolithic Eastern Bloc of our timeline. It is the great question that hangs over this entire scenario. Without Hitler, would Europe have been spared another great war? The answer is, complex, but it's highly plausible that a second global conflict on the scale of our World War II would have been averted. The First World War was so traumatic, so utterly devastating, that the political will for a repeat performance simply did not exist among the Western democracies. The policy of appeasement in our timeline was not just about weakness, it was born from a genuine popular horror of another war. Without a uniquely aggressive, expansionist, and ideologically driven power like Nazi Germany, the casus belli for such a conflict is, frankly, difficult to find. However, this does not mean the continent would have been at peace. The most likely instigator of a major European war would have been Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Stalin's ambitions were not limited to defending Russia. He was a committed ideologue who believed in the eventual global triumph of communism. He might have seen the political and economic turmoil of the 1930s and 40s as an opportunity to expand Soviet influence westward, perhaps by engineering a communist coup in a strategically important country like Poland or Romania, and then moving the Red Army in to support the workers' revolution. This would have been the most probable flashpoint for a major war. Such a war would have been fundamentally different from World War II. It would have been an ideological crusade, pitting a Franco-British-led European coalition against the Soviet Union. The front lines would have been in Eastern Europe. Germany, its military constrained by treaty, might have been a non-belligerent, its industrial capacity serving as the arsenal of democracy. For the Western powers, a role played by the United States in our history, the fighting would likely have been a brutal war of attrition, with the technologically superior but smaller Western armies facing the massive manpower of the Red Army. The United States would almost certainly have stayed out of the direct fighting, at least initially. The outcome of this Second Great War would likely be a bloody stalemate. The Western powers would probably succeed in halting the Soviet advance and preserving the independence of key states like Poland, but they would lack the manpower to march on Moscow and defeat the Soviet Union outright. The war would likely end not with an unconditional surrender, but with a negotiated peace, establishing a fortified, militarized border running through Eastern Europe, an Iron Curtain forged in hot war rather than cold. The continent would be left divided and scarred, but it would have avoided the racial genocidal character of Hitler's war, and the Holocaust would not have happened, a profoundly important distinction that makes this a lesser, though still terrible, catastrophe. The visual landscape of Europe's great cities in 2025 would be a testament to this alternate path, blending preserved history with a different kind of futurism. London even grander, with maglev lines connecting to a vast, modernized docklands. Neo-Gothic administrative towers for the Commonwealth blend with the old, projecting imperial continuity and technological supremacy. Paris, the undisputed continental capital. The historic core is pristine, but the Grands boulevards feature silent, autonomous electric vehicles and holographic advertisements. The Eiffel Tower is a hub for stratospheric communications, Moscow more austere. The Kremlin remains the center of power, but the city's architecture is dominated by imposing, functionalist Soviet realist structures from the 1970s and 80s, showing less capitalist influence. Istanbul, a more orderly and prosperous city, the elegant hub of trade between Europe and the Middle East, its skyline a mix of historic minarets and sleek corporate headquarters of Anglo-French companies. Berlin, a grand but sober city. The old imperial buildings remain, but new construction is in the functionalist Bauhaus style. It is an economic, not political capital, clean and efficient but lacking the vibrancy of Paris or London. Madrid, less central to European affairs. A beautiful, well-preserved historic city, a major cultural center but economically lagging behind the Franco-German core. Kiev, a city caught between worlds. Its architecture would show a mix of traditional Ukrainian styles, French-funded modernist projects, and a few stark Soviet-era buildings on its eastern fringes. Rome, the proud capital of a significant Mediterranean power. Mussolini's architectural ambitions would be partly realized, with grand avenues and monumental fascist-era buildings, integrated with advanced infrastructure and a bustling port at Ostia. Bucharest, the Little Paris, would have lived up to its name. Elegant Belle Epoque architecture would be perfectly preserved, integrated with tasteful modern developments funded by French and British oil companies. Hamburg, Germany's gateway to the world and a key rival to London's ports. Its harbour would be a futuristic marvel of automated cranes and drone-managed container ships. The architecture relentlessly modern and efficient. Warsaw, one of Europe's great historic gems. The Paris of the East, its beautiful old town and diverse neighbourhoods would be intact, retaining its large Jewish quarter. New buildings would be elegant and French-influenced. Budapest, much the same, but with a more pronounced nationalist character. A fiercely independent capital, its grandeur would be meticulously maintained as a symbol of Magyar pride, with less foreign architectural influence. Vienna, a buzzing hub of Central European culture and finance. Its imperial core would be augmented by daring Bauhaus and modernist structures, a city where the legacies of Freud and Wittgenstein seamlessly blend with a thriving, diverse intellectual scene. Minsk, a small provincial capital on the edge of the Soviet sphere. It would be far less developed, a quiet backwater with a mix of old Polish and Russian architecture, a forgotten corner of Europe. Prague, an industrial and cultural powerhouse. The city of 100 spires would still be beautiful, but its periphery would be a showcase of advanced Czechoslovakian and German engineering, with futuristic factories and research parks.